"Sir, you need to leave now before I call security," the boutique manager hissed, her perfectly manicured finger pointing toward the door. The black man standing before her, dressed in a simple navy suit, raised an eyebrow. He had been calm throughout the encounter, but her words pushed him to speak. "Call security," he said, his voice steady but edged with disbelief. "Do you even know who I am?" "I don't need to know who you are to see what you're trying to do," she snapped, arms crossed. "I've been in retail for over 15 years, and I can spot a thief from a mile away." A crowd of shoppers had started to gather, their eyes darting between the manager and the man. Whispers filled the air, their curiosity feeding the tension. "I suggest you take another look at my face," the man replied, his voice growing firmer. He reached into his pocket, and the manager flinched as if he had drawn a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a sleek leather wallet and flipped it open. What he revealed wasn't a credit card, but a business card, one that displayed his name in bold letters, followed by a title that left everyone speechless. Elijah Carter, owner. The manager's face turned pale as she read the words, her eyes flicking up to meet his. "I what? No, this has to be a mistake," she stammered, her confidence crumbling. Elijah leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to ensure the crowd still heard. "Let me make one thing clear. You just accused the new owner of this boutique of being a thief." Gasps rippled through the room as shoppers turned to each other, shocked. The manager's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no words came out. Elijah's gaze didn't waver. "Now, what do you think happens next?" The day had started like any other at the exclusive boutique on Madison Avenue. Sarah Montgomery, the boutique manager, prided herself on running a tight ship. Known for her sharp eye and no-nonsense attitude, she had built a reputation for maintaining the store's luxury appeal. Her regulars adored her, and her staff respected her, though some whispered about her quick temper and her tendency to judge too quickly. That morning, Sarah had arrived early to prepare for a big announcement. Word had spread among the staff that the boutique had been sold to a new owner, someone with plans to modernize the store while keeping its high-end reputation intact. Sarah wasn't thrilled about the change. In her mind, no one could run the store better than she did. By noon, the store was bustling with activity. Wealthy customers browsed the racks, their chatter blending with the soft instrumental music playing overhead. Sarah kept a close eye on everything, from the arrangement of the designer handbags to the attitude of her sales associates. Everything seemed under control, until Elijah walked in. From the moment he stepped through the doors, Sarah noticed him. He wasn't dressed like the typical customer who frequented their store. While his suit was well-tailored, it lacked the flashy designer logos she was used to seeing. And he didn't carry himself with the hesitant air of a window shopper. Instead, he moved with purpose, scanning the store as if he were evaluating it. Her suspicions kicked in immediately. She had seen this before, someone pretending to shop while planning to steal. When he picked up an expensive leather jacket and inspected the tag, her alarms went off. She whispered to one of her sales associates, "Keep an eye on him. I don't like the look of this." Minutes later, Elijah approached the counter with the jacket. He placed it down and said, "I'll take this." Sarah's voice was sharp as she cut in. "I'll handle this one," she told the associate before stepping up to Elijah. "Sir, can I help you?" "I believe I just said I'd like to buy this jacket," he replied, his tone polite but firm. "And how exactly do you plan to pay for it?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. Elijah tilted his head, clearly taken aback. "With my card." "Oh, I'm sure," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But let's not waste time. Hand over the jacket, and we'll avoid making a scene." The accusation caught Elijah off guard, but he remained calm. "Are you suggesting I can't afford this jacket?" he asked. Sarah folded her arms. "I'm suggesting it's highly suspicious that you're in here at all." The exchange escalated from there, drawing the attention of nearby shoppers. When Sarah threatened to call security, Elijah knew it was time to reveal the truth. As the crowd around them grew, Sarah's humiliation deepened. She struggled to process what had just happened. Elijah's calm but firm demeanor only made her feel worse. I didn't know," she stuttered, still holding the business card. "You didn't introduce yourself." "And I shouldn't have to," Elijah replied. "A paying customer shouldn't need to prove they belong here." Sarah's eyes darted to the growing crowd. Her reputation as a manager was unraveling before her eyes, and she didn't know how to salvage it. "Can we speak privately?" she whispered. Elijah shook his head. "No. Whatever we need to discuss can happen right here. You've already made this public. Tension hung thick in the air as the shoppers waited to see what would happen next. Would Elijah fire her on the spot? Would she apologize? The question swirled, leaving everyone on edge. Then, without warning, the boutique's front doors swung open. A man in a dark suit stepped in, his expression unreadable. He carried a briefcase, and his eyes scanned the room before landing on Elijah. "Elijah," the man said, his voice authoritative. "We need to talk. Now." Elijah's jaw tightened as he turned to the man. "Is this about the acquisition?" "It's more complicated than that," the man replied, glancing uneasily at the crowd. "We should step outside." Sarah watched, her stomach churning. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just about her mistake. It was bigger, much bigger. Elijah turned back to Sarah. "Don't go anywhere. This isn't over." He followed the man toward the door, leaving Sarah and the crowd frozen in place. The shoppers whispered among themselves, speculating about what had just unfolded. Sarah felt her legs wobble beneath her as she gripped the counter for support. What could possibly be more complicated than this? She didn't have to wait long to find out. Moments later, the boutique security alarms blared, sending a wave of panic through the room. Everyone turned toward the sound, their hearts racing. Something was very, very wrong. The piercing wail of the alarm echoed through the boutique, silencing the whispers and halting everyone in their tracks. Shoppers clutched their bags nervously, their eyes darting around the store. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to process what was happening. She had just endured the most humiliating moment of her career, and now this? Elijah turned abruptly at the sound of the alarm, his posture stiffening. The man in the dark suit, who had barely made it halfway out the door, paused and exchanged a sharp glance with Elijah. "What is that about?" Elijah asked, his voice sharp and commanding. "I don't know," the man replied, gripping his briefcase tightly. "But it's bad timing." The boutique security guard, an older man named Frank, jogged toward Sarah with a confused expression. "The system's showing a breach in the storage area," he said breathlessly. "The storage area?" Sarah repeated, blinking in disbelief. "That's impossible. We have strict access protocols. Nobody can get in there without clearance." "Well, someone just did," Frank replied, pointing at the flashing indicator on the control panel near the counter. "And they tripped the alarm doing it." Elijah stepped closer, his face a mix of curiosity and concern. "What's in the storage area?" he asked Sarah directly. "Inventory," she replied automatically, though her voice was shaky. "High-value items that aren't displayed on the floor yet. Limited editions, prototypes. Basically things worth a small fortune." Elijah narrowed his eyes. "Do you have cameras in there?" Sarah nodded quickly. "Yes." "Frank, pull up the footage." Frank rushed to the security console and began typing furiously. The screen blinked to life, showing a grainy live feed of the storage area. At first, it looked empty, rows of shelves stacked neatly with designer goods. Then, movement caught everyone's attention. A shadow darted across the frame. "There," someone in the crowd shouted. Frank rewound the footage, and the room fell silent as the screen revealed a figure in a black hoodie entering the storage area. The intruder moved with practiced precision, bypassing the locks as if they'd done it 100 times before. "Who is that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. She glanced at Elijah, whose jaw was clenched. He didn't answer. Hours earlier, Elijah had been sitting in his office, reviewing the final paperwork for the acquisition of the boutique. It was a significant milestone for him, a move that symbolized how far he had come. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, he had dreamed of success but never imagined owning a luxury brand. Yet here he was, ready to take the reins of one of the most exclusive boutiques in New York City. His assistant, Mason, had entered the office with a folder. "The team at the boutique is expecting you today," Mason said. "You'll need to review the staffing structure. There've been complaints." "Complaints?" Elijah raised an eyebrow. Mason hesitated. "Let's just say some of the staff might not align with the values you want to bring to the brand." Elijah sighed. He knew what Mason meant. He had heard about Sarah Montgomery's reputation, her tendency to make snap judgments and her lack of tact. He had planned to meet with her that afternoon to assess the situation. Now, it seemed like fate had decided to escalate matters on its own. Back in the boutique, Frank froze the footage on the clearest frame of the intruder. The figure's face was obscured by the hoodie, but the image was enough to confirm one thing: whoever they were, they knew exactly what they were doing. The way they moved, avoiding the main shelves and heading straight for a locked cabinet, suggested an inside job. "Check the employee log," Elijah said sharply. "See who was supposed to have access to that room today." Sarah hesitated before responding. "Only 3 people have the clearance: me, Frank, and Stacy, our inventory manager." "Where's Stacy now?" Elijah asked. Sarah glanced around the room, realizing Stacy wasn't anywhere to be seen. She should be here. She was scheduled for this shift. Frank frowned. "She clocked in this morning. But I haven't seen her in the last hour." Elijah exchanged a glance with Mason, who had quietly entered the store during the commotion. "Get her on the phone," Elijah instructed. Sarah grabbed her phone and dialed Stacy's number, her fingers trembling. The call went straight to voicemail. "She's not answering," Sarah said, her voice tinged with panic. "Convenient," Mason muttered under his breath. Before anyone could respond, the boutique's back door slammed shut with a loud bang. The sound startled everyone, and Frank immediately grabbed his radio to alert additional security. Elijah didn't wait. He strode toward the back of the store, his long strides leaving Sarah struggling to keep up. "Wait. You can't just go back there." Sarah protested. "Watch me," Elijah shot back without turning around. When he reached the storage area, he found the door slightly ajar. He pushed it open cautiously, revealing rows of empty shelves where the most valuable inventory had been stored. The cabinet that had been locked in the video now hung open, its contents gone. "Looks like your thief didn't leave empty-handed," Elijah said, glancing at Sarah. She stared at the empty shelves, her face pale. This can't be happening." "It's happening," Mason said, stepping into the room. "And it's a PR nightmare waiting to explode. Do you know how much those items are worth?" "Millions," Sarah whispered. "Easily." As they spoke, Frank's radio crackled with static. "Got something," a voice said on the other end. A black SUV just sped out of the alley behind the store. Could be connected. Elijah's mind raced. He had walked into the boutique expecting to deal with management issues, not a full-blown heist. But now, with high-value inventory missing and suspicion swirling, the stakes had changed. He turned to Sarah, his expression hard. "We need to call the police." She nodded weakly, but before she could reach for her phone, the boutique's front doors swung open again. This time, it wasn't a shopper or staff member. 2 police officers entered, their hands resting on their holsters. "We got a report of a theft," one of them announced, his eyes scanning the room. "Yes," Sarah blurted, relief washing over her. "Thank God you're here." But the officer wasn't looking at Sarah. His gaze locked onto Elijah. "Sir, we need to ask you some questions." Elijah's brow furrowed. "Me? Why?" The officer exchanged a glance with his partner. "We received a tip. That matches your description. Black male, mid-30s, wearing a suit." Sarah's mouth dropped open as the words registered. The crowd, which had begun to settle, erupted into murmurs again. "You've got to be kidding me," Elijah said, his voice cold. "I'm the owner of this store." The officer raised an eyebrow. "You can explain that at the station. Hands where we can see them." The room fell silent as everyone watched the scene unfold, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The boutique was dead silent except for the sharp clinking sound as Elijah's wristwatch hit the counter when he raised his hands. His movements were slow and deliberate, his jaw clenched in frustration. Sarah's breath hitched as she looked on, her mind racing. This couldn't be happening, not after everything that had already gone wrong today. "You're making a mistake," Elijah said, his voice firm but calm. "I can explain everything if you'd let me." The officer nearest to him stepped forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "If that's the case, you'll have your chance to explain at the station." "This is ridiculous," Mason interjected, stepping between the officer and Elijah. "He's the owner of this boutique. You're detaining the wrong person." The officer hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the new piece of information. "If that's true, then why did we get a report matching his description at the scene of the theft?" "What report?" Elijah asked, his eyes narrowing. "Who made it?" The officer glanced at his partner, then at Sarah. The caller didn't give a name but described a black male in a suit acting suspiciously in connection with stolen goods. Sarah's mouth opened, but no words came out. She could feel everyone's eyes on her, and a sinking feeling settled in her stomach. She hadn't made the call, but she couldn't shake the possibility that her earlier behavior had planted the seed in someone else's mind. "Whoever made that call is either mistaken or lying," Mason said, his voice sharp. "And you're about to embarrass yourself in a very public way." The officers exchanged glances, and the one holding the cuffs seemed to hesitate. But before he could respond, Frank's voice crackled over the radio. "Officers, we've got new footage. You'll want to see this." One of the officers lowered his handcuffs. "Show us." Frank motioned them to the security console, where he had rewound the footage to just after the initial breach. This time, the camera caught a clearer glimpse of the intruder's face as they turned toward the door with an armful of stolen goods. They were wearing a hoodie, but underneath, a flash of blonde hair was visible. It was enough to rule out Elijah entirely. "That's not him," Frank said firmly, pointing at the screen. "And it sure isn't a suit." The officer who had been skeptical sighed heavily, rubbing his temple. "Looks like we were given bad intel." "You think?" Mason snapped, his frustration evident. The officer turned back to Elijah, his tone more measured now. "Apologies, sir. It seems there's been a misunderstanding." Elijah lowered his hands, his gaze cold and steady. "A misunderstanding? Is that what you call profiling and false accusations?" The officer shifted uncomfortably. "We're just following protocol." "It wasn't personal." "It felt personal," Elijah said. His voice wasn't raised, but the weight of his words silenced everyone in the room. "You didn't hesitate for a second to assume I was guilty." Sarah felt her face grow hot. Every word Elijah said struck a chord with her, too. She had made her own assumptions about him the moment he walked into the boutique, and now those assumptions had spiraled into something far worse. "Let's focus on finding the real thief," Mason said, cutting the tension. "You have a getaway vehicle, footage, and a suspect description. Start there." The officers nodded, clearly eager to shift the focus. "We'll need a copy of this footage," one of them said to Frank. "Already on it," Frank replied, burning the video onto a flash drive. The officers left moments later, taking the drive with them. The murmurs in the boutique began again as shoppers processed what had just happened. Elijah turned to Sarah, who stood frozen near the counter. "This all started with you," he said, his voice quiet but laced with anger. "If you hadn't treated me like I didn't belong here, none of this would have escalated." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry. I made a mistake." "A mistake?" Elijah repeated, his tone incredulous. "That's all you have to say?" Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but she was interrupted by Frank, who had returned to the storage area console. Mr. Carter," he called out hesitantly. "You might want to see this." Elijah exchanged a glance with Mason before heading toward the console. Sarah hesitated, unsure if she should follow, but curiosity, and guilt, propelled her forward. Frank replayed the footage, this time focusing on a small detail that had been easy to miss earlier. As the intruder moved toward the exit, they passed by a mirror on the wall. Reflected briefly in the glass was someone standing near the door, a figure who wasn't wearing a hoodie. "It's hard to make out," Frank said, zooming in. The image was grainy, but the figure appeared to be a woman in her mid-30s with blonde hair pulled into a ponytail. Sarah gasped. "That's Stacy." Frank nodded. "It sure looks like her." "Wait," Mason said, his brow furrowing. "You're telling me your inventory manager was standing there while this happened? Why didn't she call for help? Better yet, where is she now?" The air in the room grew heavier as the implications sank in. If Stacy had been there, she either knew the intruder or was somehow involved. Elijah rubbed his temples, his frustration mounting. "Sarah, you said she's not answering her phone?" Sarah nodded quickly, feeling more out of control by the second. "She hasn't been seen since the theft started." Elijah turned to Mason. "Get her personnel file. I want to know everything about her." Mason nodded and pulled out his phone to access the employee records remotely. As he worked, Sarah felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Not only had she mishandled Elijah's arrival, but now her own staff was at the center of a major theft. Moments later, Mason looked up from his phone, his expression grim. "We've got a problem." "What kind of problem?" Elijah asked. Mason held up the phone, showing Stacy's profile. "She's been listed as an employee here for 6 months, but the references on her application are bogus. The addresses don't exist, and the phone numbers are dead ends." Sarah's stomach dropped. You're saying she lied on her application? That's exactly what I'm saying, Mason replied. And here's the kicker, her last listed job? It's a boutique across town that reported a similar theft right before she left. Elijah's expression darkened as the pieces started to come together. She's been planning this for months. Sarah felt her knees weaken, and she gripped the edge of the counter for support. How could I have missed this? Elijah turned to her, his gaze sharp. Because you were too busy judging people like me to notice the real threat. Sarah flinched, his words cutting deeper than any accusation the officers had made. Before she could respond, Frank's radio crackled again. Sir, a voice said, urgency in their tone. We've just spotted the SUV. It's abandoned 2 blocks away, but it looks like some of the stolen goods are still inside. Elijah straightened. Then let's go. Sarah hesitated. What about the boutique? We can't just leave it unattended. Elijah's expression softened slightly, though his frustration was still evident. You stay here and deal with the fallout. Mason and I will handle this. Sarah nodded, watching as Elijah and Mason headed toward the door. The crowd of shoppers parted to let them through, their expressions a mix of awe and guilt. Sarah stood frozen, torn between relief that the attention had shifted and the sinking realization that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The front door slammed shut behind Elijah, and Sarah turned to find the remaining staff staring at her. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, the boutique's phone rang. She picked it up hesitantly, her hands trembling. Hello. A cold, unfamiliar voice came through the line. You're looking for Stacy, aren't you? Sarah's blood ran cold. Who is this? The line went dead. Sarah stood frozen, clutching the phone as the dial tone buzzed in her ear. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she had just heard. The voice on the other end wasn't Stacy's. It was deeper, colder, and deliberately cryptic. Who was that? Frank asked, his voice cutting through the tense silence. Sarah hung up the phone, her hand trembling. I don't know, she admitted. But they know about Stacy. Frank frowned, his concern evident. That's not good. If they're calling here, they're either watching us or trying to throw us off. Sarah's pulse quickened. The boutique suddenly felt smaller, its luxurious decor offering no comfort against the rising unease. She glanced at the remaining staff and the lingering shoppers, who were still murmuring about the morning's events. We need to shut the store down, Sarah said firmly, her voice breaking through the chatter. Everyone out. The staff exchanged uncertain looks, but Frank nodded, taking charge. You heard her. Stores closed for the rest of the day. Everyone, please make your way to the exit. There were murmurs of protest from the customers, but the sight of Frank's stern expression and the flashing security lights convinced them to comply. Within minutes, the boutique was empty except for Sarah, Frank, and the few staff members left behind. Meanwhile, Elijah and Mason jogged down the sidewalk toward the alley where the SUV had been abandoned. 2 officers stood guard near the vehicle, their hands resting on their belts. The SUV's back doors were open, revealing several designer handbags and clothing racks hastily piled inside. Looks like they didn't have time to grab everything, Mason observed as they approached. Elijah frowned, scanning the scene. Or they left it here on purpose. One of the officers stepped forward. Mr. Carter, we've secured the vehicle. Some of the stolen inventory is inside, but there's no sign of the suspect. Did you dust for prints? Elijah asked. The officer nodded. We're working on it now, but if this is professional, they probably wiped the vehicle clean. Elijah sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. This heist wasn't just opportunistic, it was meticulously planned. Stacy wasn't just an employee with sticky fingers, she was part of a larger operation. He could feel it. Did anyone see who left the SUV here? Mason asked. Just a vague report from a bystander, the officer replied. They said someone in a hoodie ran down the alley and jumped into another vehicle. No plates, no make or model. Elijah's frustration grew. It felt like every lead ended just as quickly as it began. We need to find Stacy, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. She's the key to all of this. Mason nodded. Agreed. But if she's gone underground, it won't be easy. Elijah turned to the officer. What's the protocol for tracking someone like this? The officer hesitated. Normally, we'd start with known associates, addresses, and phone records. But if she used fake references on her application, it could take time to trace her. We don't have time, Elijah said sharply. He pulled out his phone and began typing furiously. Mason, reach out to our private investigator. Tell them to start digging into Stacy's past. If there's a connection between her and this heist, I want to know about it. Mason nodded, already dialing the number. Back at the boutique, Sarah paced the now quiet store, her thoughts swirling. The mysterious phone call had rattled her, but she knew she couldn't let it show. Not to the staff, and certainly not to Elijah when he returned. Frank approached her cautiously. You okay? He asked. No, Sarah admitted. But we need to focus. If Stacy's involved, there's no telling how deep this goes. Frank nodded. I'm checking the security footage again to see if I missed anything. Maybe there's another angle that'll give us more clues. Good idea, Sarah said, though her voice was distant. She was still thinking about the call. The voice had sounded so deliberate, almost taunting. Whoever it was, they wanted her to feel scared, and it was working. As Frank disappeared into the back room, Sarah's phone buzzed with a new message. She glanced at the screen, her breath catching in her throat. Unknown number. You're looking in the wrong place. If you want answers, meet me at the old warehouse on 42nd Street. Come alone. Sarah's hands shook as she read the message again. It was a trap, it had to be. But what if it wasn't? What if this person had information about Stacy, about the theft, about everything? Before she could decide what to do, Frank reappeared, holding a USB drive. Got something, he said. The footage from earlier shows Stacy acting strange. Sarah frowned. Strange how? Frank plugged the drive into the boutique's computer and pulled up the video. On the screen, Stacy could be seen pacing near the storage area door, glancing over her shoulder repeatedly. A few minutes later, the intruder appeared, and Stacy seemed to give them a subtle nod before walking out of the frame. She let them in, Sarah whispered, her stomach churning. She was in on it. Frank nodded grimly. Looks that way. Sarah's phone buzzed again, pulling her attention back to the mysterious message. Unknown number. Tick-tock, Sarah. The longer you wait, the less you'll know. Her mind raced. If she told Elijah or the police about the message, they'd insist on handling it their way. But whoever this was, they wanted her specifically. She didn't trust them, but she couldn't ignore the possibility that they had answers. Frank, she said, her voice low. If I left for a bit, could you hold things down here? Frank raised an eyebrow. Where are you going? I just need to clear my head, she lied. It's been a rough day. Frank looked skeptical but nodded. Sure. Just be careful. Sarah grabbed her coat and slipped out the back door, her heart pounding. The address from the message wasn't far, just a few blocks away. As she walked, she tried to steady her breathing, but her mind was racing with worst-case scenarios. When she reached the old warehouse on 42nd Street, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the crumbling structure. The building looked abandoned, its windows shattered and its doors hanging off their hinges. Sarah hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Inside. Second floor. Sarah clenched her jaw and stepped through the creaking doorway. The interior was dark, lit only by streaks of fading sunlight filtering through the broken windows. She climbed the rickety staircase, each step echoing in the empty space. When she reached the second floor, she froze. A single chair sat in the middle of the room, and on it was an envelope with her name scrawled across the front. She approached cautiously, her hands trembling as she picked it up. She opened the envelope and pulled out a piece of paper. It contained a single sentence. Trust no one at the boutique. Not even Frank. Before she could process the message, a loud bang echoed from below. Sarah whipped around, her heart racing. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, were coming up the stairs. She backed away, clutching the paper, her eyes darting toward the nearest exit. The footsteps grew louder, closer. And then, the shadow of a figure appeared at the top of the staircase. Sarah's pulse thundered as the figure's shadow loomed at the top of the staircase. She instinctively stepped back, her eyes darting around the room for an escape route. The dilapidated warehouse offered little in the way of hiding spots, just broken beams, discarded crates, and shattered windows. The footsteps stopped. Sarah, a familiar voice called out. Her breath caught in her throat. It was Frank. Frank, she asked cautiously, her voice trembling. He emerged into view, his expression neutral but unreadable. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone calm yet unsettling. "I thought you said you were going to clear your head." Sarah clutched the piece of paper tighter, her mind racing. The note's warning, "Trust no one at the boutique. Not even Frank," rang in her ears. I needed to get some air," she stammered, forcing her voice to remain steady. "What about you? Why are you here?" Frank stepped closer, his boots crunching against the dusty floor. "I got a call from a blocked number," he said. "They said you were in trouble and gave me this address." Sarah's stomach churned. Was he telling the truth, or was he part of whatever this was? She couldn't tell. His presence didn't make sense. Why would someone lure both of them here? Unless... "You shouldn't have come," she said, trying to regain control of the situation. "It's dangerous." "Exactly why I'm here," Frank replied, his tone softening. "You shouldn't be wandering around alone after everything that's happened." Sarah took a step back, keeping her distance. "I don't need your help." Frank stopped, his expression hardening slightly. "What's going on, Sarah? Why are you acting like this?" Before she could answer, the warehouse creaked loudly, and the sound of a door slamming echoed from the floor below. Both of them froze, their eyes meeting in shared alarm. "Who else is here?" Frank whispered, his hand instinctively moving to the flashlight clipped to his belt. "I don't know," Sarah replied, her voice barely audible. "I didn't see anyone when I came in." Frank motioned for her to stay put as he pulled out the flashlight and moved toward the staircase. "Stay here," he ordered. "I'll check it out." Sarah wanted to protest, but she didn't trust her voice not to betray her fear. She watched as Frank descended the stairs, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness below. The creaks of the staircase grew fainter until they were swallowed by silence. She waited, her breathing shallow, straining to hear anything from below. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. And then, nothing. "Frank," she called out tentatively, her voice shaking. No response. Her hands trembled as she took a step toward the staircase, the paper still clutched in her fist. Every instinct told her to run, but she couldn't leave without knowing what had happened to Frank. As she peered down the staircase, her heart jumped into her throat. The flashlight lay on the ground at the base of the stairs, its beam flickering weakly. But Frank was nowhere to be seen. Meanwhile, Elijah and Mason were back at the boutique, poring over the information Mason had uncovered about Stacy. Her connections to past thefts were troubling, but they also painted a picture of someone who was more than just an opportunistic thief. "She's been involved in 3 separate incidents over the past 2 years, Mason explained, pointing to the records on his tablet. Each one involved a high-end boutique, and each one ended with her vanishing right before the heist was discovered. And no one caught her?" Elijah asked, his frustration evident. "Not yet," Mason replied. "She's careful. She doesn't use her real name, and she switches identities with every job. The only reason we know it's her is because of the pattern." Elijah leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Stacy wasn't just a thief, she was part of an organized operation, possibly even the mastermind. But what bothered him most was how easily she had infiltrated his boutique. "She must have had help," he said aloud. "Someone on the inside vouched for her." Mason nodded. "That's what I'm thinking. We need to figure out who else is involved." Elijah's phone buzzed, pulling his attention away. It was an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Mr. Carter," the voice on the other end said, smooth and confident. "I believe we have a common problem." Elijah's grip tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" "Someone who knows where Stacy is," the voice replied. "And what she's planning next." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "If you know so much, why don't you tell me?" "All in good time," the voice said. "But first, I need to know if you're willing to deal." Elijah's jaw clenched. "What kind of deal?" "One that benefits both of us," the voice said. "Meet me at the old warehouse on 42nd Street. Bring no one." Elijah's heart sank. The warehouse, the same address Sarah had mentioned earlier when she left. He glanced at Mason, who was watching him closely. "I'll think about it," Elijah said, and hung up before the voice could respond. "What was that about?" Mason asked. Elijah stood abruptly. "I think Sarah's in trouble." Back at the warehouse, Sarah crept down the staircase, her every step making the wood groan beneath her weight. The flashlight flickered weakly at the bottom, casting eerie shadows across the floor. She crouched to pick it up, her hands shaking as she scanned the room. "Frank," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The silence was deafening. She moved cautiously through the darkened space, her flashlight beam darting over abandoned machinery and piles of debris. Just as she was about to turn back, a low groan reached her ears. "Frank," she called out again, louder this time. The groan came again, closer now. She followed the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. Finally she found him, slumped against a wall, his head lolling to the side. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed, rushing to his side. "Frank. Are you okay?" Frank stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "Sarah, get out of here," he croaked. "What happened?" she asked, her voice frantic. "Who did this?" Before he could answer, a loud bang echoed through the warehouse, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Sarah whipped around, her flashlight trembling in her grip. The shadows around her seemed to grow darker, closing in. "Run," Frank whispered weakly. But it was too late. The footsteps stopped, and a figure stepped into the dim light. They were wearing a black hoodie, just like the intruder from the security footage. But this time, they weren't alone. Behind them, two more figures emerged, each carrying something that glinted in the faint light. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Sarah froze, her breath caught in her throat. The three figures advanced slowly, their presence filling the cavernous warehouse with an ominous tension. The leader, the one in the black hoodie, tilted their head, studying her like a predator sizing up prey. "Look what we've got here," the hooded figure said, their voice calm but laced with menace. "You just couldn't stay out of it, could you?" Sarah gripped the flashlight tighter, her knuckles turning white. "Who are you?" she demanded, though her voice wavered. The figure chuckled, a sound that sent chills down her spine. "That doesn't matter. What matters is you weren't supposed to be here. Neither was he." They gestured toward Frank, who was barely conscious against the wall. "What did you do to him?" Sarah asked, her voice growing steadier as anger pushed past her fear. The figure shrugged. "He got in the way. Same as you." Sarah's mind raced. She didn't know who these people were or what they wanted, but the threat was clear. She had to think fast. Behind her, Frank groaned again, his pained sounds fueling her resolve. "What do you want?" she asked, trying to buy time. The figure in the hoodie took a step closer. "Answers. You see, you've been asking the wrong questions. Instead of worrying about Stacy, you should have been wondering who she works for." Sarah's stomach churned. "You." The figure smirked. "Smart girl. But it's not just me. Stacy's just one piece of the puzzle. We've got bigger plans, and you're meddling where you don't belong." Sarah's grip tightened on the flashlight. "If you have everything you want, then why are you here? Why leave a message for me?" "Because," the figure said, their tone turning cold, "you were getting too close. Now we need to send a message. To you, to Elijah, to anyone who thinks they can stop us." The name Elijah hit her like a bolt of lightning. They knew who he was. They knew everything. "What do you mean by that?" she demanded, stepping back instinctively. The figure didn't answer. Instead, they snapped their fingers, and the two others moved forward. One grabbed Sarah by the arm while the other knelt next to Frank, pressing something metallic against his side. "Stop!" Sarah shouted, struggling against the grip on her arm. "Don't hurt him." The hooded figure leaned closer, their face still obscured in the dim light. "Then you'd better listen carefully." Meanwhile, Elijah was speeding toward the warehouse, Mason in the passenger seat. The call from the unknown number had rattled him, but it was the mention of the warehouse that had set him on edge. Sarah hadn't returned any of his calls, and the thought of her walking into a trap made his stomach churn. "Do you think she's really there?" Mason asked, breaking the tense silence. "She's there," Elijah replied, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. "She left the boutique acting strange, and now this. It's too much of a coincidence." Mason nodded. "If this is connected to Stacy, then whoever lured Sarah there is playing a bigger game." Elijah's jaw clenched. "And I intend to find out what it is." The warehouse loomed into view, its shadowy form more imposing than Elijah had imagined. He parked the car at the curb, cutting the engine. "Stay close," he told Mason as they climbed out. The two men approached the building cautiously, their eyes scanning for any signs of movement. The front door was ajar, the faint sound of voices drifting from within. Elijah motioned for Mason to follow as he stepped inside. Back on the second floor, Sarah was desperately trying to keep her composure. The figure holding her arm tightened their grip, making it clear she wasn't going anywhere. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice sharp with defiance. The hooded figure smirked. "You're going to deliver a message to Elijah for us. Tell him this isn't just about the boutique. We've been watching him for a long time. His little empire isn't as secure as he thinks." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Why not tell him yourself?" "Because," the figure replied, stepping closer, "you're going to be our proof. Let him see what happens when people don't mind their own business." The other figure, still kneeling by Frank, pressed harder against him, eliciting a groan of pain. Sarah's heart raced. She had to think of something, anything, to stop this. "What's your endgame?" she asked, stalling for time. The hooded figure chuckled. "Our endgame? It's already in motion. Elijah's just the first step." Before they could say more, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse. Everyone froze, their heads snapping toward the source of the noise. Heavy footsteps followed, growing louder and more deliberate. "Who's there?" the hooded figure barked, their voice sharp with authority. The footsteps stopped, and a voice called out from the shadows. "Let her go." Sarah's heart leapt. It was Elijah. The hooded figure's posture stiffened, and they turned toward the direction of the voice. "Ah, Mr. Carter," they said smoothly. "Right on time." Elijah stepped into the dim light, his expression hard and unyielding. Mason followed close behind, his phone out and recording. "You have something that doesn't belong to you," Elijah said, his voice steady. "Let her go, and we can talk." The hooded figure laughed, the sound echoing eerily in the empty space. "Talk? You think you're in a position to negotiate?" Elijah's eyes flicked to Sarah, who was still being restrained. His jaw tightened, but he kept his tone calm. "You're outnumbered, and we've already called the police. Your best option is to walk away while you still can." The hooded figure's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before they recovered. "You're bluffing." "Try me," Elijah replied. The tension in the room was electric. The figures exchanged uncertain glances, clearly debating their next move. The one holding Sarah's arm loosened their grip slightly, and she took the opportunity to jerk free, stumbling toward Elijah. "Enough," the hooded figure snapped, their voice cutting through the tension. "This isn't over." With a sharp motion, they signaled to the others. The group retreated quickly, vanishing into the shadows before anyone could react. Elijah rushed to Sarah, his hands on her shoulders. "Are you okay?" She nodded, though her legs felt like jelly. "Frank, he's hurt." Mason moved to check on Frank, who was conscious but weak. "He'll need medical attention," Mason said. "But he'll be okay." Elijah turned back to Sarah, his expression filled with concern. "What were you thinking, coming here alone?" Sarah pulled the crumpled note from her pocket and handed it to him. "I didn't have a choice. They left me this." Elijah read the note, his eyes narrowing. "Trust no one at the boutique," he muttered. "Not even Frank." Sarah hesitated, glancing at Frank. "Do you think it's true?" Elijah's expression darkened. "I don't know. But whoever these people are, they're playing a dangerous game, and they're just getting started." Elijah paced the boutique's empty showroom later that night, the tension in his chest coiling tighter with every step. Sarah sat on one of the sleek designer chairs near the counter, sipping from a paper cup of coffee Frank had made earlier. She was pale and jittery, clutching her coat like it was armor against the fear still gnawing at her. Frank had been taken to the hospital, leaving just Elijah, Sarah, and Mason to regroup. The boutique's once luxurious ambience now felt suffocating under the weight of unanswered questions and unseen threats. "We're missing something," Elijah said, his voice taut. "This isn't just about Stacy. Whoever those people are, they're bigger than her." Mason, leaning against the counter, tapped his phone thoughtfully. "We need to figure out how they got their hooks into the boutique. Stacy's fake references didn't just slip past us. They were planted for a reason." Sarah looked up, her eyes shadowed with guilt. "It's my fault," she said quietly. "I didn't dig deep enough into her background. I should have caught it." Elijah stopped pacing and turned to her. "Blame isn't going to help us right now. What matters is figuring out what their endgame is and how we stop it." Mason cleared his throat. "There's something else," he said, holding up his phone. "I ran Stacy's supposed work history through some deeper databases. Her connection to the previous boutique thefts was bad enough, but this? It's worse." Elijah crossed the room in 2 strides, peering over Mason's shoulder. What do you mean? Mason tilted the screen so Sarah could see as well. It displayed a map with red markers, each one highlighting high-end boutiques across the city. These are all the locations Stacy worked at, or claimed to. Every single one has reported a similar theft in the last 2 years. Sarah frowned. So she's been running the same scam over and over? Not exactly, Mason replied. The stolen inventory is always high value, but it's also always insured. Each boutique took a hit, sure, but the insurance payouts covered the losses. What's strange is that none of the stolen items ever show up on the black market. It's like they disappear. Elijah's brow furrowed. Why would someone go to all this trouble if they're not reselling the goods? That's what I'm trying to figure out, Mason said. But there's more. Stacy didn't just vanish after each job. She went dark for months, only to reappear under a new identity at the next target. Sarah's face tightened. Are you saying she's part of a ring? Not just a ring, Mason said grimly. A network. And they're careful, too careful. These aren't amateurs. Elijah's mind raced. A network of thieves targeting high-end boutiques, stealing insured goods that disappeared without a trace. It sounded too elaborate for a simple money grab. And now, they had turned their sights on him. Hours later, Sarah sat in the employee break room, trying to make sense of the events. The room's warmth and familiarity felt at odds with the chaos she'd faced. Elijah joined her, setting a cup of tea in front of her before sitting across the table. You don't have to stay, he said gently. After what you've been through, no one would blame you if you took a step back. Sarah shook her head, her hands trembling as she held the cup. I can't walk away, Elijah. This is bigger than me. If I leave, they win. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. I respect that. But I need you to be careful. Whoever these people are, they're not done. They wanted to send a message tonight, and we need to be ready for whatever comes next. Sarah glanced at the paper with the ominous warning, still lying on the table. Do you think we can trust anyone? Elijah's gaze hardened. I don't know. But we're going to find out. The next morning, Elijah and Mason met with a private investigator named Carla Reynolds, a sharp-eyed woman with a reputation for solving cases no one else could. Carla leaned back in her chair at a small cafe, flipping through the file Mason had compiled. This is messy, she said, her voice brisk. Your Stacy isn't just a thief, she's bait. Someone higher up the chain is pulling the strings, and they're using her to infiltrate places like your boutique. Elijah folded his arms. What do they want? Carla raised an eyebrow. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? If they're not fencing the stolen goods, then they're using them for leverage. Blackmail, bribes, who knows? Mason leaned forward. Can you track her down? Carla smirked. I can try. She's good at covering her tracks, but no one's perfect. If she's still in the city, I'll find her. Elijah nodded. Do it. And let us know the moment you have something. As Carla left the cafe, Elijah's phone buzzed with a message. It was from an unknown number. You didn't get the message last night, did you? Stay out of it, Elijah. Or next time, it won't just be a warning. He showed the message to Mason, his expression grim. They're watching us. Mason frowned. Do you want to report it? Elijah shook his head. Not yet. Let's see what Carla digs up first. At the boutique, Sarah was reviewing inventory logs, trying to spot any anomalies Stacy might have left behind. She was so focused that she didn't notice the door open until the bell jingled. She looked up to see a delivery man holding a package. Delivery for Ms. Montgomery, he said, setting the box on the counter. Sarah frowned. I didn't order anything. Just sign here, the man said, holding out a clipboard. Reluctantly, she signed, and he left without another word. The package was plain and unmarked, its weight heavier than she expected. Heart-pounding, she grabbed a pair of scissors and cut through the tape. Inside, she found a single object, a designer handbag, one of the items stolen during the heist. Her blood ran cold as she pulled out a note tucked inside the bag. The handwriting was the same as the previous notes. A reminder of what's at stake. Choose your side carefully. Sarah's hands shook as she reread the note, the message clear. The thieves weren't just sending warnings, they were testing her. And now, they were forcing her to make a choice. Back at his office, Elijah's phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. This time, the message was chilling in its simplicity. Check your cameras. Elijah's stomach twisted as he opened the boutique's live security feed. What he saw made his blood run cold. A figure in a black hoodie stood in the middle of the showroom, staring directly into the camera. They held up a sign that read, "Time's running out." Before Elijah could react, the figure turned and disappeared, leaving the boutique's door swinging shut behind them. Elijah bolted out of his office, phone in hand, dialing Sarah as he headed for the boutique. His thoughts raced. The image of the hooded figure still burned into his mind. "Sarah, where are you?" he asked as soon as she picked up. "I'm at the boutique," she replied, her voice tight. "Something just happened. A package. Get out of there. Now." Elijah interrupted, his voice sharper than he intended. Sarah paused. "What? Why?" "They were just there," Elijah said, already crossing the street toward the boutique. A hooded figure, one of them, was inside. "You're not safe." There was a beat of silence before Sarah said, "I'm locking the doors." "No." Elijah snapped. "Don't trap yourself. Leave the building. I'll be there in 2 minutes." The line went dead, and Elijah's heart pounded as he picked up his pace. When he reached the boutique, the sight of the locked door sent a wave of dread through him. Peering inside, he saw Sarah standing near the counter, clutching the package. He pounded on the glass. "Sarah, open up." She jumped, startled, then hurried to unlock the door. Elijah stepped inside and immediately scanned the room, his senses on high alert. It felt too quiet, too still. "What were you thinking?" he asked, his frustration bubbling over. "You should have left." "I didn't want to leave the store unattended," Sarah said defensively, holding up the package. And then this showed up. Elijah took the package and pulled out the handbag, his expression darkening. "This is from the stolen inventory." Sarah nodded. "And it came with a note. They're trying to scare me." Elijah's jaw tightened as he read the note. A reminder of what's at stake. "Choose your side carefully. They're not just trying to scare you," he said grimly. "They're trying to control you." Sarah's face paled. "What do we do?" Elijah paced the floor, his mind racing. "We can't let them think they've won. But we also can't underestimate them. They're watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake." Sarah hesitated, then said, "I think they already have someone on the inside." Elijah stopped, his eyes narrowing. "What makes you say that?" She recounted the details of the package delivery, her suspicions growing with every word. "Someone had to know I was here alone. And someone had to coordinate with the courier. It wasn't random." Elijah nodded slowly. "You're right. And if they've infiltrated our staff, we need to figure out who it is, and fast." Later that evening, Carla called Elijah with an update. Her voice was brisk and businesslike, but there was an edge to it that told him the news wasn't good. "I tracked Stacy's last known location," Carla said. "She was seen getting into a car at a bus terminal on the west side. The car's registered to a shell company. No surprise there." "Did you find anything useful?" Elijah asked. "Maybe," Carla replied. "The shell company's records lead to a larger network of offshore accounts. Whoever's running this operation, they've been laundering money for years. And it's not just boutiques, they're targeting high-value businesses across multiple industries." Elijah leaned back in his chair, processing the information. "So this isn't just about inventory theft. It's about power." "Exactly," Carla said. "And Stacy's just one cog in a much bigger machine. I'm still digging, but you need to be careful. These people don't play by the rules." "Understood," Elijah said. "Let me know as soon as you find something concrete." At the boutique, Sarah was reviewing the security footage from earlier in the day, hoping to catch a clearer glimpse of the hooded figure. She paused the footage when she noticed something unusual. In the corner of the screen, barely visible, was a reflection in one of the glass displays. A second figure. Her stomach sank as she zoomed in, trying to make out the details. The reflection was blurry, but it was unmistakably someone else, a person standing near the back of the store, watching everything unfold. She immediately called Elijah. "There were 2 of them," she said as soon as he answered. "What?" Elijah asked, his tone sharp. "I was reviewing the footage. The hooded figure wasn't alone. There was someone else in the boutique. They stayed near the back watching." Elijah swore under his breath. "Did you get a clear look at them?" "No," Sarah admitted. "The reflection's too blurry. But it means they're more coordinated than we thought." Elijah's silence spoke volumes. Finally, he said, "Lock up for the night. I'll be there in an hour." As Sarah prepared to leave, she noticed something unusual near the back of the store, a small folded piece of paper sticking out from one of the displays. Her pulse quickened as she approached it, her instinct screaming at her to leave it alone. But curiosity won out. She unfolded the paper, her heart sinking as she read the message. "We're always closer than you think." The lights in the boutique flickered, and Sarah spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The room was empty, but the air felt heavy, like she was being watched. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she nearly dropped it as she fumbled to answer. "Elijah," she said, her voice shaking. But the line was silent. "Hello," she tried again. Then a voice, low and distorted, came through the line. "You should have walked away when you had the chance." The call ended abruptly, and Sarah stared at her phone, her hands trembling. Her fear turned to determination as she grabbed her bag and headed for the door. She couldn't do this alone anymore. But just as she reached for the lock, the boutique's lights went out entirely, plunging the room into darkness. And then a faint sound, a whisper of movement, came from behind her. Sarah froze, her fingers inches from the lock. The faint sound of movement behind her sent chills down her spine. She swallowed hard, her breathing shallow as she turned slowly, her eyes straining to adjust to the darkness. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Silence. She clutched her phone tightly, her thumb hovering over the emergency call button. The boutique, once a space of luxury and refinement, now felt like a trap, its shadows stretching and shifting as if alive. Then, a low, deliberate tap echoed through the room. Once. Twice. Her heart pounded as she backed toward the door, her hand fumbling for the lock. Just as she turned it, a figure emerged from the shadows, a silhouette outlined by the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the boutique's windows. "Leaving so soon," the figure said, their voice calm but unervingly cold. Sarah didn't answer. She yanked the door open and bolted outside, her heels clattering against the pavement as she ran. The street was eerily quiet, the distant hum of traffic the only sound. She glanced over her shoulder but saw no one following. Her phone buzzed again, startling her. She skidded to a stop under a streetlight and answered without checking the caller ID. "Elijah," she gasped. They were there. In the boutique. "I saw them." "Where are you?" Elijah's voice was sharp, urgent. "2 blocks down." I ran. "Stay where you are," he interrupted. "Mason and I are on our way." Minutes later, Elijah's car screeched to a halt beside her. He jumped out, followed closely by Mason, who was holding a flashlight. "Are you okay?" Elijah asked, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "I'm fine," Sarah said, though her voice trembled. But they were inside. One of them spoke to me. "I don't know how they got in or what they wanted, but," she broke off, shaking her head. "I can't go back there." "You're not going back there," Elijah said firmly. "Not until we figure this out." Mason shone his flashlight down the street, his expression tense. "If they're bold enough to show up at the boutique, they're escalating. We need to figure out their next move before they make it." Elijah nodded. "We'll regroup at my office." "Come on." In Elijah's office, the tension was palpable. Carla joined them shortly after, carrying a laptop and several folders. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I've been digging deeper," she said, spreading out the files. "Whoever's behind this is operating on a scale far larger than we initially thought. They're not just targeting high-end boutiques, they're infiltrating businesses across multiple sectors. Jewelry stores, tech firms, even private art collectors." Elijah frowned. "Why? What's their goal?" Carla tapped her laptop, pulling up a map dotted with red pins. "Power. Control. They're not just stealing goods, they're destabilizing businesses. Each target weakens a competitor or shifts the market in their favor. It's a calculated strategy." Sarah leaned forward, her fear giving way to anger. "So Stacy was just a pawn." "Exactly," Carla confirmed. "A disposable asset. And they'll have others lined up to replace her." Mason crossed his arms. "How do we stop them?" Carla hesitated, then said, "We need leverage. Something they value enough to expose themselves." Elijah's jaw tightened. "The stolen inventory. They didn't resell it, which means they're holding onto it for a reason. If we can find it." "They'll come to us," Carla finished. But it's a huge risk. They've already shown they're willing to escalate. Elijah glanced at Sarah, whose expression was steely despite the fear lingering in her eyes. We don't have a choice. If we don't stop them now, they'll keep coming. The next day, Sarah and Mason worked to identify possible locations where the stolen inventory might be stored. Using the map Carla had provided, they pinpointed several warehouses and storage facilities connected to the shell companies linked to the network. One location stood out, a recently rented warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The lease was under a different name, but the pattern of transactions matched the others. That has to be it, Mason said, pointing to the screen. It's isolated, and the timeline fits. Elijah nodded. We'll check it out tonight. Sarah's stomach churned. You're not going alone, are you? No, Elijah said firmly. Carla's arranging backup. We'll have eyes on every angle. That evening, Elijah, Mason, and Carla met near the warehouse. The area was desolate, the air heavy with anticipation. Sarah had insisted on coming but stayed in the car, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she watched the team gear up. Elijah approached the car and leaned through the open window. Stay here, he said. If anything goes wrong, drive to the nearest station and call the police. Sarah nodded, though her heart raced. Be careful. He gave her a small reassuring smile before heading toward the warehouse. The warehouse was dark and eerily silent, its exterior giving no indication of what lay inside. Elijah and Mason moved cautiously, their flashlights sweeping across the abandoned loading docks. Carla monitored the scene from a nearby van, her laptop displaying feeds from strategically placed cameras. There's movement inside, Carla said through their earpieces. 3 heat signatures. They're spread out, but one is heading toward the back exit. Got it, Mason replied, motioning to Elijah. They split up, each taking a different route into the building. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and damp metal. Elijah moved quietly, his flashlight catching glimpses of crates and pallets stacked haphazardly. He paused when he saw a row of shelves covered with tarps. Lifting one, he uncovered rows of designer handbags and clothing. The inventory's here, he said into his earpiece. They've got everything. But before he could investigate further, a low voice cut through the darkness. I was wondering when you'd show up. Elijah spun around to find the hooded figure standing a few feet away, their face still obscured. In their hand, they held a knife, its blade glinting faintly in the flashlight's beam. You're persistent, the figure said, their tone almost amused. But this is where it ends. Elijah's grip on his flashlight tightened. You're out of time. The police are on their way. The figure chuckled, taking a step closer. You think that scares me? We've been ahead of you at every turn. You're just another loose end to tie up. Before Elijah could react, the sound of a gunshot shattered the tense silence. The figure staggered, their knife clattering to the ground. Mason appeared from the shadows, his gun trained on the now wounded intruder. Stay down, Mason ordered. Elijah exhaled, his pulse racing as the figure slumped against a crate. Nice timing. Mason smirked. You're welcome. But before they could secure the scene, a loud crash echoed from deeper within the warehouse. Both men turned, their adrenaline surging as they realized the fight wasn't over. The crash reverberated through the warehouse, followed by hurried footsteps and the unmistakable sound of a heavy metal door slamming shut. Elijah and Mason exchanged a quick glance, their expressions taut with resolve. We're not alone, Mason muttered, adjusting his grip on his weapon. Carla's voice crackled through their earpieces. 2 more heat signatures just disappeared off the cameras. They've moved out of range, likely to the east side. Be careful. Elijah nodded, motioning for Mason to follow. Secure this one, he said, gesturing to the wounded figure slumped against the crate. I'll check it out. You're not going alone, Mason countered. We do this together. Reluctantly, Elijah agreed, and the two moved cautiously through the dimly lit warehouse. Their footsteps were muffled against the concrete floor as they approached the source of the noise. Each step heightened their awareness, the tension in the air thick and oppressive. Back in the van, Carla monitored the feeds, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she tried to regain visuals on the fleeing suspects. They're heading toward a service tunnel on the east side, she said. I'm sending coordinates to your phones. Sarah, still waiting anxiously in the car outside, listened to Carla's updates with growing dread. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her instincts screaming at her to stay put, but the thought of Elijah walking into danger pushed her over the edge. She opened the car door and slipped out, determination replacing her fear. Elijah and Mason reached the eastern section of the warehouse, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Rows of machinery and stacked crates created a labyrinthine layout, perfect for someone trying to escape or ambush. "There," Mason whispered, pointing to a partially open door leading to the service tunnel. Elijah nodded, and the two advanced silently, their movements coordinated and deliberate. As they reached the door, a loud metallic clang echoed from inside the tunnel. Mason pushed the door open, his flashlight revealing a long narrow passage littered with debris. They stepped inside cautiously, their senses on high alert. The sound of footsteps grew louder, then suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of electricity from exposed wires along the tunnel walls. And then it happened. A figure darted out from the shadows, lunging at Mason with a crowbar. Mason reacted instinctively, sidestepping the attack and disarming the assailant with a swift motion. Elijah tackled another figure who emerged from behind a crate, pinning them to the ground. "Who sent you?" Elijah demanded, his voice a mix of anger and urgency. The figure beneath him laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You think you're stopping something big, but you're just scratching the surface." Before Elijah could press further, the assailant's hand moved toward their pocket. Elijah reacted quickly, pulling the figure's hand away to reveal a small blinking device. "It's a timer," Mason said, his voice sharp. "We need to move now." Elijah and Mason scrambled to their feet, dragging the two suspects toward the exit. Carla's voice came through their earpieces again, frantic. "Get out of there. The whole place is wired." Outside, Sarah spotted Elijah and Mason emerging from the warehouse, dragging the two subdued suspects. She ran toward them just as Carla pulled up in the van. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "We're fine," Elijah replied, glancing over his shoulder at the warehouse. "But we need to get clear." As if on cue, a series of small explosions rippled through the building, shattering windows and sending a plume of smoke into the night sky. The ground shook beneath them as they ran for cover, shielding themselves from flying debris. When the chaos subsided, they turned to see the warehouse engulfed in flames. The stolen inventory, the evidence, everything, they were gone. Later, at the police station, the two captured suspects sat in separate interrogation rooms, their expressions blank and uncooperative. Despite hours of questioning, they refused to reveal anything about the organization they worked for or their motives. Elijah, Mason, Sarah, and Carla watched from behind a one-way mirror, their frustration palpable. "They're not going to talk," Carla said. "They're too well trained." "So what now?" Sarah asked, exhaustion evident in her voice. Elijah exhaled deeply. "We regroup. We use what little we have and keep digging. This isn't over." Carla nodded. "The network's bigger than we thought, but now they know we're onto them. That gives us an advantage." Mason added, "And they've lost 2 of their people. It's a small win, but it's something." As the group left the station, Elijah placed a reassuring hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You did good," he said. "They tried to break you, but you didn't let them." Sarah managed a small smile. "We're not out of the woods yet." "No," Elijah agreed. "But we're closer." Weeks later, the boutique reopened with increased security measures and a renewed sense of purpose. The events of the past month lingered in everyone's minds, a reminder of the hidden threats lurking in plain sight. Though the stolen inventory was never recovered, the team remained resolute in their commitment to rebuilding stronger than ever. For Elijah, the ordeal was a stark lesson in trust, vigilance, and the lengths people would go to for power. For Sarah, it was a turning point, a chance to confront her own biases and prove her strength in the face of adversity. The network might have escaped this time, but Elijah knew one thing for certain: they had made an enemy who wouldn't stop until they were brought to justice. And that fight was only just beginning.